Good afternoon. We're going to talk about Windows Event Forwarding and OSSEC today. So the first thing that I want to talk about is why specifically I wanted to talk about this. So one of the things about BSidesAugusta is that coming here over the last several years, there's a lot of defensive talks. And there's a lot of people who are students or maybe starting off in their career who come to this conference. So I wanted to kind of pick something that is something that I think a lot of people can do. And the subtitle for this presentation is You Can Do This. So just show of hands, who represents an organization that has less than, let's say, 1,000 employees. Okay, so maybe half. Is anyone here support less than maybe 200? Okay, all right. So a lot of the presentations that you see, and if you're on Twitter and you are going to other conferences, people are talking about supporting organizations that have 10,000 endpoints. That might not, those types of techniques might not be applicable to what you do. So the unfortunate thing that happens is once you start engaging with the community, there's this thing called the Perfection Fallacy or the Nirvana Fallacy, where if your solution doesn't fix everything, someone is going to show up and say, but that doesn't scale, or you know, that's not going to fix this problem. It always comes up with patching, right? So the WannaCry stuff, the MS-1710, you know, some people come out and say, just patch your machines. Somebody immediately comes out and says, you don't know my environment. Well, you're the best person to understand your environment. And people coming out and talking about that, you know, immediately responding back with this perfection fallacy and all that kind of stuff is like us having a healthcare discussion and I say everyone needs to wash their hands and someone comes up immediately and says washing your hands doesn't cure cancer, right? It's not helpful. So given that specifically in the United States, the vast majority of organizations are actually really small. So in my professional career, I support a agency that does economic development, and a lot of the people that we interact with are actually really small. So the 10,000 endpoint thing doesn't represent you trying to do security for an accounting firm in Augusta, Georgia, where you have 250 staff members, right? So the other thing that happens is a lot of times, especially in smaller organizations, IT is responsible for security, or there might only be one security person, or you know, some combination of things like that. So one of my arguments also is that the vast majority of the things that you do with security are directly applicable to traditional IT, right? So you have the CIA Triad, which is just fancy, you know, that's the other thing that happens during presentations. There's lots of acronyms, right? The CIA Triad, Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Integrity and availability is a direct IT responsibility, right? Machines go down, IT is responsible for it. So security things don't necessarily have to be so separated from security until you start to get into these big scale things and separation of duties and all that kind of stuff, right? So the other thing that's important is to begin to really understand what's normal in your environment, and doing things like monitoring endpoint logs, which is primarily what I'm going to talk about, is one of the best things that you can do. So we just had an excellent presentation in this room from people doing red teaming, right? Those techniques that they were using would have lit up the majority of environments that are doing endpoint monitoring, if those people also look at what's normal in your network, right? So using the theoretical example of the accounting firm in Augusta, how many times is someone that works in an accounting firm going to run Who Am I? Never. It's highly unlikely that they're even going to run the net command. So once you start to determine what's normal for your environment, techniques like endpoint monitoring, my argument is that you should immediately alert on things like Who Am I, net, the scheduled task stuff, NetSH. Those are not normal things for even DIR. When's the last time that you sat down at someone's desk to do whatever, especially if you come from a help desk background and then went into security? A executive vice president of a corporation isn't going to sit down and write and hit DIR, type DIR. So everything that I'm going to talk about is, quote, free, meaning that it's either built into Windows or it's an open source free project. And this idea that you can do it is primarily that, like what Dave Kennedy was talking about this morning, y'all are the person that's eventually going to make the decisions about these things, right? So you want to automate as much as possible to bubble up to the person that determines what's normal for your environment. So why me? A lot of people do the about me thing. So what I specifically wanted to talk about is why do I consider myself someone that can talk about this topic? I have a lot of experience with Windows. I'm started off, in the NetWare days with Windows 3.1 and NT 3.5.1, all that stuff. I'm one of those Gen X Slackware Linux people who, used it when you could burn up your monitor and destroy your hard drive or whatever. I like to take tests, so that's the GX stuff. As I said, I'm an IT director for a state agency. For the state that is across the river, which you can, and I don't work for the Department of Revenue in South Carolina. Some of you will know why that's funny. I use WEF, event forwarding, and OSSEC every day. So the first part is the Windows event forwarding, right? So how many people use Windows event forwarding now? Not very many. Okay. So Windows event forwarding is built into the operating system. So a lot of people have talked about this over the last couple of years, and there's a variety of reasons for it. And one of the primary thing is because it's built in. It doesn't require an agent. Those of you who have Active Directory domains, which is probably going to be all of you, these configurations can be sent out via group policy. So basically what you're doing is you're setting up an agent, you're setting up a Windows Event Collector server, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, that the clients are going to send their logs to. So given that this is a lightning talk and I'm not going to have a ton of time to get into technical detail, what I wanted to really emphasize is you go to learn from people that do this all the time. So the NSA's IAD, which now is just cybersecurity or something, they changed a lot of their names, created a paper 5 years ago maybe, spotting the adversary with Windows Event Log Monitoring. It's an excellent paper. The Australian Signals Directorate also has one. It gets into what are the actual group policies that you need to set up in order for this to work, all the way down to what types of events do you want to subscribe to and what is the reason for subscribing to those events. Jessica Payne works for Microsoft. That's her Twitter handle, J Payne MSSP. She has a presentation called Monitoring What Matters. It's a video where she talks about Windows Event Monitoring. She also is the sponsor of this thing called the Weffels Project, which is a probably a, I mean, it's not a, it's a Microsoft tool that's used, but it's not something that you can buy. It's on GitHub. And then Palantir, regardless of what you think about what the work that Palantir, whatever, the internal Windows team at Palantir is awesome. So they have GitHub, which has everything that they use event forwarding for, in addition to some papers on how to set it up. All of these papers are going to be similar to the NSA paper. The Palantir paper is a little bit newer. They're using this actually to monitor in the neighborhood of 10,000 endpoints, I believe. So even though I'm talking about using it at a smaller scale, it is scalable. Microsoft's recommendation is to not put more than 10,000 endpoints on one collector. So if you're supporting 250 machines, it only requires one VM. So the other thing is OSSEC, right? So a lot of you, anyone use OSSEC or know about OSSEC? Okay. OSSEC has been around for quite a while. It was originally written by Daniel Sid. It's all log-based. So its job is it's a host intrusion detection system. It's basically reading logs off of whatever device, the logs come from, and then performing some kind of action. So the majority of the time, what that's going to be is an alert. Although in the Unix-based, whatever Linux, BSD, it can fire off active response. So if you're using it on a web server, you can use it to write to IP tables. There's some stuff that you can do in Windows, but it doesn't work very well. So the server is Linux-based generally. The Windows client, Windows is the only thing that requires a client. The rest of them, you basically have to compile. But it's not difficult if you're used to doing stuff in Linux. Atomic Corp is actually kind of the current maintainer of a lot of the OSSEC stuff. There's a lot of forks of OSSEC, but those first three, Atomic Corp, Waza or Wazoo, however you want to pronounce it, Alien Vault, the Wazoo and Alien Vault actually have a pseudo SIEM kind of environment that is using OSSEC. And then my favorite, of course, since we're here in Augusta, is Security Onion. So you've seen it mentioned in 401 and 504 if you take SANS classes. The other thing that comes up sometimes when you're talking about OSSEC is why not use OS query? So go ahead is my argument. Whatever you're going to use to do your endpoint monitoring, it's better to begin down a path and then iterate. So we chose to go the OSSEC path. Some people may choose to go OS query. There's a lot of functionality that's the same, like OS query can do file integrity monitoring and things like that, but my personal preference is OSSEC because I've used it for a long time. So the two things together, right? So one of the problems with OSSEC is key management. Maintaining OSSEC clients isn't fun. So what you do is you're enrolling an agent with the OSSEC server, and then the communication gets set up so that the log information gets sent via the agent to the OSSEC server, and then there's a log monitor that is going to do the interpretation based off of your rules and then perform whatever kind of action there is. So the architecture that I'm proposing to use in this case is use Windows Event Forwarding, set up the policies based off of the things that are written in those papers, get all of your logs going to one collector, and then maintain the connection between your Windows Event Collector and the OSSEC server. That way you don't have to put agents on your endpoints. You still have to monitor the Windows Event Collector to determine whether or not you have agents dropping off and things like that, or sorry, you have clients dropping off, but you don't have to do the key management, you don't have to do any of that kind of stuff. So use the guidance from those papers, the NSA, Palantir. Microsoft has excellent guidance. Security, logs, application crashes, AppLocker, device guard, task scheduler, all that kind of stuff. The other thing that I highly recommend that you integrate with this is Sysmon. So Sysmon can be extremely chatty, but disk space, as they say, is relatively cheap. So if we're also talking about smaller environments, it might not be bad to start out with getting more data and then pull it back as needed. Because the more information that you get, the better off you're going to be, and then you can make the determination of you don't need this anymore or whatever. So the examples from earlier today, like Dave Kennedy was talking about, PowerShell talking out to the internet. You can get that kind of information from Sysmon, write a rule in OSSEC, and get an alert without no special devices required, nothing, but brain power. So the way to do this is the typical way that you go about doing any kind of IT or security infrastructure project. Take a small number of machines. I would argue that part of this process, you need to evaluate your tiers of computers, right? So you have computers that have access to certain types of data, and in your environment, you might have some group of computers that has access to PII, like your accounts payable or your HR people or whatever. Set everything into tiers and then start working from that. Everything's done via group policy, as I said. Once the stuff starts coming through, you can actually go into the event log viewer on the collector and just look at it to make sure that stuff's working. In this case, you can do push or pull, which the papers will talk about. I would suggest using the push method. So your clients check in with the collector. They get the subscription that says, please send me your 4624s from the security log. Once they've done the check-in, they have some period of time where they're going to send their logs to the collector. So that can handle, theoretically, it could handle remote clients that are going to be out and come back in, stuff like that. It uses WinRM, which you might be familiar with PowerShell remoting, 5985 or 5986. Who knows the difference between the two of those? And it's not that one of them isn't encrypted. (5986) uses TLS, right? So 5985 doesn't. However, which this comes up occasionally, and I believe Jason Fawson talks about this in his Windows class. Once the connection is set up on port 5985, the communication actually is encrypted with the AES symmetric key. So even though the initial connection isn't encrypted between the endpoint and the other side, either with PowerShell remoting or with this, the communications actually are encrypted. So OSSEC, the agent itself is fairly lightweight. You are going to produce a lot of logs doing this, right? So disk space, though, is cheap, as I said. OSSEC itself is included with Security Onion, including some visualizations in the new Elasticsearch, Kibana stuff. I would argue that you need to monitor your domain controllers and the WEF collector. So installing the OSSEC agent actually on the domain controller will get you things like all of your logins going to your OSSEC server, and the built-in rules with OSSEC are going to include things like security group changed. So if someone changes the contents of the domain admin's group without doing any kind of customization at all, you're going to get an alert that this security group changed. New users logging in, you can use the functionality in OSSEC that are lists. so that you have a list of all of your sensitive accounts, and if you see an interactive login from a higher tiered user onto a end user's machine, like a domain admin should not log in to a workstation, right? So you can actually make OSSEC alert on something like that so that because you have an operational problem. The clients talk over 1514 UDP, which actually in this case uses a very bad algorithm, but Daniel Sid's argument about that is he's never seen any exploits against the OSSEC agent using Blowfish for encryption. However, apparently that is a PCI problem. So what's happened recently is Virtual Security, who maybe in Virginia area, is working with Atomic Corp to introduce perfect forward secrecy support using noise socket, which is what Signal uses. So those of you that are concerned about OSSEC using Blowfish to encrypt its traffic, there'll soon be implementation using noise socket. Use the baseline rules just like with the event forwarding at the beginning. So then what happens is, like what we were talking about, how likely is it that somebody's going to run Who Am I? Not very likely. So there's no rule in OSSEC for Who Am I? So what you have to do is you have to go in there and start writing rules based off of your environment. And so I want to show a few different examples of some custom rules. So this is actually showing, so you've got a user GIS dude on your domain. They're running ESRI product. ESRI for some reason doesn't sign their DLLs. So this is showing that AppLocker blocked DLL load on one of your endpoints. No endpoint agent on GIS dude's computer. That AppLocker log is getting sent to the collector, and then the collector is talking to OSSEC, and OSSEC's giving you the alert. It's actually not very difficult to do at all to write a rule like that, and there's tons of examples. So one of the other things that has been talked about today is AppLocker bypasses, application whitelisting bypasses, using built-in, whatever they're called, law bins is one word that people use. The living off the land stuff, using native tools. If you're using sysmon, and obviously there's going to be ways of getting around this, right? But if you don't fall for the perfection fallacy, having this rule is better than not knowing about it at all. And then it might be that this is a developer and you need to turn it off for their machine. MS Build running on an accountant's machine is a problem, right? There's no reason for somebody to do that. Multiple Windows error events. In this case, Windows Update failed to check for updates. I'm pretty sure that is indicating that it couldn't talk to the WSUS machine. So that's useful for security, and it's also useful for IT. Not talking to WSUS is bad, and then on the security side, because they're not getting patches, not talking to WSUS is bad on the IT side. Why can't it talk to it? The other thing, PowerShell, everyone loves to talk about how PowerShell can be used and abused. I would say that you could probably, in a small environment, if you're using sysmon, you can turn on PowerShell detection and just see what happens. And you will be surprised, probably, that once you get rid of the alerts that are going to be based off of the things that the OS is doing, nobody's using PowerShell. Developers are going to use PowerShell. You just put them into a category on their own. Admins are going to be using PowerShell, put them on a category on their own. In this case, you've got a client why does Dropbox create a scheduled task to update itself? And do you even know that that happens whenever somebody puts Dropbox on their machine? Once you set up these rules, you'll start to detect, why does this Intel graphics driver run PowerShell to talk out over the internet? Doesn't make any sense. Actually, they're just assuming that they can do whatever they want, but it's your network. So once you start alerting on it, then you can make decisions about what you want to do. All right, so the overall thing is getting more endpoint visibility using built-in stuff. OSSEC has a ton of alerts built in already, like the group changes, all that kind of stuff. Writing more rules for things like speed that Windows changes occur, right? So you've got things like Windows Defender, Network Guard, or whatever. That stuff is going to get written to somewhere in the Windows event log, and if it's written to the event log, then you can write an alert for it. So once something comes out, you figure out what the event log entry is and write an alert. The other thing that's going to happen by virtue of you doing this is that you're going to learn more about your network, and you're going to have a ton of data. So while you begin with using OSSEC to get alerts, you can also take all that event log data and start putting it into a SIEM. Once you get one, or if you already have one, put it in there. Use ELK, Security Onion, whatever you want to use. Unfortunately, I'm almost out of time, so I will be happy to answer questions outside, but I'm going to ask y'all a couple of questions so that you can get these books. Don Murdoch, who was in the back of the room and left, has an excellent book called the Blue Team Handbook Incident Response Edition. So the first question that I'm going to ask is about networking. So it's not entry level, but it kind of is. What protocol number is UDP? The gentleman in the orange shirt. Yeah, you. Yep. Either. Yeah, one. Yeah, 17 or 11, depending on your number system. All right, so is there anyone in here that considers themselves to be a super Windows guru? No? All right, well, I'll ask this question and we'll see if anybody knows. What file system be fully realized except for in partially SQL Server? That is not it, but it's related to that. NFS. So who said that? Okay. So it's actually Windows Future Storage, WinFS. ReFS is the one that you can actually use, but WinFS, I think, Gates identified as one of his biggest disappointments because it was being Vista. Vista kind of sucked, but all right. I have one more thing. What is the literal origin of big and little endian? Yes. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Actually, has nothing to do with computers, byte order, all that kind of stuff. A lot of the old school computer wizards were literary nerds, lots of jokes and stuff like that. So it actually comes from Gulliver's Travels. All right, so I want to thank you and thank BSidesAugusta. And like I said, I'll be outside if y'all want to talk about this. And I'm on Twitter, the Twitters, FR Columba, or you can email me at infosec@epipsyche.org.